Okay, so hi there. My name is Dan Kohn, and I'm going to talk for a little while about the interactive landscape. I had an idea of how to try and make this session a little bit more interesting, which is I was just going to tell you a little bit about it and why we created it and how. And then I don't know if people saw there was an announcement this morning from Google of a new project they have called gvisor, which is a container, sort of a container runtime. It's also a whole kernel and virtual machine and other kinds of things. But I thought we could just go ahead and add that to the landscape, and you could see the process of editing on the fly, and then it just takes a couple minutes for it to upload and such, and would make it a little bit more realistic. So the background here, if we dive in, is about a year and a half ago, we started this project, and it's a little insane if you go back in the history. So here's the 090, and I won't go through every one here, it'd be a little too boring. But boy, did the landscape look different then, and it was in some ways so much simpler. I mean, this is like 100 logos on there, and we're up to 500 now. And the categories were actually somewhat similar, although there's some sort of randomness on there, like third-party APIs, and we had languages and frameworks, which was just never going to scale. So trying to decide, and we were missing things like cloud-native storage, cloud-native networking. And so we've gone through something around a dozen iterations since then until we've gotten to the one we have today, which is I mean, just incredibly detailed and too much so in some ways. Now, I would ask you to go by the CNCF booth in the hall, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to bring them over, but we have this document printed out on A4, which actually does look nice and is a good take-home. And then partly as a response to criticism that I got for that document, and as I mentioned this morning, that is called the Hellscape, we created this document, which is designed to go on sort of the front page, the front half of the page of the Cloud Native Trail Map. It walks you through the progression of how most enterprises kind of deal with CNCF projects or think about it. And the key thing is the containerization, the CI/CD comes first and before any other step. And only then do you look at Kubernetes and then observability and analysis, Prometheus, FluentD. Excuse me just one sec. Oh, it's got it. I got it. Thanks. Yeah. Sorry about that. So the other piece that we added in here over time is we have a serverless working group, and they went out and did a nice survey of all of the options out there, and we this wasn't quite the first version. We've iterated through it a little bit, but we have our serverless landscape as well now. And so you can see we divided up tools, security, frameworks, where you can then deploy these on different kinds of hardware, platforms, meaning commercial services that will run your serverless. And then the one that I find most interesting is installable, essentially because a lot of those run on top of Kubernetes and the rest of the cloud-native architecture and are really about decomposing some of the things people love about serverless and making them more generally available. And so if I zoom in here, and I'll just mention that there are being talks at this, there's a serverless track, I believe, tomorrow, and Kubeless, OpenFAS, Fission, a couple of these are all being featured. Nucleo, that are Dispatch, that are all quite interesting. So what I found, though, is that, you know, I'm obviously both the creator of this document. Oh, I guess I have to just make the little joke here that because in this latest version, so we have the serverless landscape, which has this cloud native landscape in the bottom of it, and then we have the cloud native landscape, which right here has a little serverless section and says see the serverless landscape for more info. So it was just sort of required that we create the inception of that, where we can just endlessly zoom in from one to another, which is a little crazy looking. But we should probably create a higher resolution version of it. So what I was finding, just even as a consumer of these, is that I would often just find a project I hadn't heard of, and I would almost always be doing the same set of tasks to go research it, which is I would Google it and find the GitHub repo, and in fact, let's just even take this one. So here's gvisor that Google just open sourced this morning. You can see 296 stars, and in the half hour since I last loaded it, they're now up to 355 stars. You can see that they have 7 contributors. There's only 20 commits, so I think it was literally like the last couple days where was their first commit. But all of this info, so I would just sort of check that out, and then in a lot of cases I'd want to look up on Crunchbase and see what are the services, what's the company behind it, if it's not Google and I wasn't that familiar with it. So that was really the impetus for starting this interactive landscape, was just to say, hey, what's a tool that I would find useful? Which, of course, is a great way to develop things, to try and scratch your own itch. And thankfully, in this case, it seems like other people had the same itch. So if I go in here now and I choose landscape categories, and then I go to container runtime, here are the container runtime projects. And let me zoom in a ways so that hopefully that's more readable. So for instance, there's 2 projects right now that are circled in the light blue that are in CNCF. Containerd, which is essentially the runtime that's been factored out of Docker and is going to become the basis of Docker again going forward. And just some quick statistics, you have things like the first commit was 2 years ago. CNCF helped negotiate this at actually the morning before Seattle KubeCon a year and a half ago. And the latest commit was this week, so it's telling you it's an active project, 125 contributors, which is quite large. And then it's nice that they have their own Twitter feed, and you can come in and see some updates and info and such. You can also see, for example, that they passed the CII Best Practices badge. It's Apache 2.0, so those kinds of things. And then compare that to, say, Singularity. So this is out of Lawrence Livermore Labs, I believe, but it's a startup has been created, Scilabs, that has this. It has 587 stars, 3 years old, active project, and they have their own Twitter feed for it. And then there's some ones that are just a little less actively. LXD out of Ubuntu, out of Canonical, and they're also active this week. So this was a way to the part of the idea for the app was to just pull in all of the information that I'd want to see. And anyway, I get the headquarters and the market cap or the funding from Crunchbase, and so CNCF had to set up a licensing deal with Crunchbase. And then every day, this app, an update server, goes out to Crunchbase and loads in all of the latest information, and it goes out to GitHub and loads in all the latest information, and then makes a commit to itself, and that automatically redeploys. So let me just go ahead and show you that. By far, and I'm going to want to zoom here so that you can see. Okay, so Google just created an app called Scaffold, and I'm going to cheat here and copy the YAML. And because everyone loves YAML, there's a KubeCon bingo that someone published. And one of them is doing a demo in YAML, and the other one is a reference to no code, which of course I mentioned this morning in my keynote. So I'm well on my way to winning the bingo game. But I just take this one because it already has the Google piece in there. And then if I go to containers and find containerd, and so here's the container runtime section of the YAML, GHI. So it's going to go right here above Intel Clear Containers. And I have a little indenting problem. That's annoying. Actually, that's very annoying and odd. you know what? I think I have this, if I have this set up to be tabs instead of spaces, it's not going to work. And I'm going to call it GAdvisor, and then find the repo. And just note that it doesn't have its own separate homepage yet. They may add that in the future. But so I'm just going to use the same URL for both the homepage and the repo. And then I have a great advantage of a graphic designer who works with the Linux Foundation. Sorry, and I'm even spelling it wrong. And she just threw this together for me, GVisor. I'm not totally within the Google Cloud brand guidelines, most likely, but hopefully, among other things, this encourages them to actually create a logo for their project, and then they can just issue a pull request, and we will promptly update it. But that was GVisor, and she sent that to me, and I'm just going to drag that into my hosted logos folder. But to make this easy, we also let people, if they have an SVG that's online, they're welcome to just link to that, and we'll fetch it down. And so then the Twitter's correct is GCP Cloud, and the Crunchbase is correct is Google. And so now if I come over, and let me, again, zoom up, I can just see that the only thing, so I just added that one section in, and I can see that I have this one new piece. So now I'm going to run a command, yarn fetch, which we've built in. So this is now running the app that we created. And I do want to give a shout out here to Andrei Kozlov, who's a contractor who's been working with me. He's based in Moscow, and he's just been an absolutely fantastic partner on the development of this. It's been just so much fun, really, to be able to see things that were sort of wrong with the app or need to be fixed, create a couple issues in GitHub, go to bed, and then wake up the next morning and often find that they were already done. Okay, and it can't find that address, so let me just make sure that that's correct. It could just be a https://github.com, a Wi-Fi issue here, but we'll see if this does it. So it's now going off to GitHub and fetching the latest version of all of this info. And in fact, if I come back here and choose reload again, my 355 stars is up to 368. And I will just point out why it's growing so much, which is, yeah, it's now down to the #2 story on Hacker News, but it's just getting a ton of interest and attention there. Okay, so this time it worked, and now if I look at the diff again, I can see that this is the same. But what's interesting is that I edit the landscape.yml, that's where I'm doing all the information, and then below is what we call process landscape.yml, which is basically just a cache of all of this information that we're storing. So here's the homepage, the stuff that I put in, but then it just went to GitHub and it found out it's an Apache 2.0 project. The description is sandbox container runtime. I have a commit date, a commit link, contributor count, contributor link, and then it went to Yahoo Finance and pulled down the very latest market cap info and saw that there's not a best practices badge, and that, okay, so now I can do, just add that into my Git repo, git commit GVisor, and git push. And this is probably the part of the app that's the most fun for me, is that it's an entirely serverless application. So we compile this, it uses React, but every time your browser loads it, it's just fetching in a static file. And so right now, we're using a service called Netlify that I do recommend. It's hooked up to GitHub, and it saw that push and is going to go ahead and spin up a container where it's going to compile the app and create the whole pieces necessary and then make them available. And so, and when it does so, the app will, and then it actually as a very final step, to go back to my keynote this morning, it does do a test and make sure that it actually works. And then it does the deployment and pushes it aside as the main master. So we'll come back to this in a few minutes, but I guess I probably could stop there, and I'd be very happy to just spend the next 15 minutes and take questions from folks. So particularly the app, how we how we chose the categories and such. I will mention the Technical Oversight Committee created an architecture document about 18 months ago that had these top levels in them. And I mean, I think if you sort of know anything about the epistemology of categorization and taxonomies, there's nothing magic about this. I mean, the biggest thing it has going for it is now thousands and thousands of people have seen this, and it seems at least reasonably useful to them. But we do actually have a new process spinning up again to relook at this architecture. And you know, I would particularly be interested in some of the categories, some of the bigger categories on here, to come back and say, oh, could we split these up? Are there other ways of looking at it that might be more clear? But on the other hand, I think it's sort of working fine. And so I will mention one of the challenges that comes up here is lots of people do come to the site and say, oh, I have the best project ever. It belongs in these 8 of your categories. And I mean, I don't even necessarily disagree with them, because there's nothing magic about this taxonomy. It's absolutely the case that some open source projects, especially some closed source products, don't fit best into a single category. But if we allowed that, we'd explode from the 500 icons we have right now to several thousand, and would really reduce the value of the logo. And so we essentially force them into picking the one that they think is best, or I'll even say least bad. So we get some pushback there. We do have the rule that you have to have for open source projects, you have to have 250 stars. Not everyone's Google and gets to the very top of Hacker News, but we felt like that was just a sort of reasonable milestone to say that there's at least a number of other folks who are kind of interested in what's going on and following your project closely. And then for open source, we don't require you to host it on GitHub. In fact, the best example of that is GitLab, which folks might be familiar with. It is a hosted competitor to GitHub. But what we ask is that you mirror your project onto GitHub, because GitHub provides a lot of very nice services to us where they'll run a license analysis on it. They'll show how many contributors. There's other pieces on here. And so GitLab has been very helpful, and they've been perfectly happy to mirror. In fact, one of their projects was already mirrored. They mirrored the other. Another example is all the Apache projects. Apache likes to host theirs on their own SVN, but all of them are mirrored to GitHub. And so we're able to pull down and get the star info and the contributors, the other kinds of pieces. So let's see if my deploy, it's almost done here. So it's finished saving the dependencies. And you can see there's nothing. And it's actually, I mean, it's not even that much code, which was sort of my point this morning. A few other interesting points. We used to have our fonts hosted by Google API, which is what most people do, but that makes it almost completely inaccessible from China. It would take like 5 minutes for it to load in and for that to time out. So we were able to just bundle our fonts into it, and it just dramatically sped up the load time. And then the very last step there was site is live. And so now, if I come here to container D, oh, and notice right here that I have 499 cards, and I click on container runtime, and I see that I have 11 cards in here, and now I hit refresh. And now I have 12. And here is Google Cloud gvisor. And so it picked up 7 contributors, first commit this week, latest commit this week. But it is fun that, for example, the first commit is actually a link to the first commit, which actually is empty in this case. And then I have the tweets from Google Cloud. And now if I come all the way back out to the top level, I'm up to 500 cards. And so this was designed to be, and just the fact that really any level of demand, Netlify puts a CDN in front of it, I'm never going to run into trouble on it. So let me stop there. That's kind of a quick look into the app. I'd be very happy to answer any questions for you about the static landscape, as we call it now, the serverless landscape, the trail map, and the interactive landscape. Just ask you to speak up if you have a question. I'm going to have to start spouting random facts about these projects if you... Yeah.
Do you think there's any point at which this is not going to scale anymore? I mean, you're at 500 cards now. What's the point at which this is no longer viable?
I mean, it's a fair question. And again, I mentioned someone calling it the hellscape earlier. It seems like the natural thing to do if folks were still getting some value from it, which I think they are, would be to break off chunks of it. So, I mean, a couple obvious areas right now are that we have separate sections on here for all of the certified Kubernetes distributions, certified Kubernetes hosted platforms, certified Kubernetes installers, non-certified Kubernetes. So I could take off 80 logos right there. And down at the bottom here, I have 41 Kubernetes certified service providers, Kubernetes trading partners, and I could create a separate landscape called Kubernetes partners, Kubernetes certification. And then we could do some really crazy Inception style thing where you could zoom in or zoom out from one to another. I mean, I guess we're kind of heading towards that. There's a famous line by the kernel developer Andrew Morton about 8 years ago or so. He said that he thought the kernel was almost done, and just another version or two that they would finish. And so I do sort of keep thinking that this project is almost done. And I mean, I will say that the velocity of new additions is going down. I mean, everyone's not coming up with random new projects every day. And we did try our best to cover them, and we had relatively clear neutral rules. But that would be, yeah, the next step. And I guess at some point I could even break off this observability and analysis part, which is monitoring, logging, and tracing, and that as well could have its own separate sheet. My hope would be that the interactive landscape would remain as a single unified one, because the magic piece here, and I'll just show you a little shortcut. So I mentioned before you can do l.cncf.io. If you do s.cncf.io, it does a redirect just to the serverless sections, which is 55 cards. And that's in order to have it be available here, the serverless landscape at s.cncf.io. But the idea is that even though the whole thing may feel overwhelming, that it's often useful to be able to do like really specific slices, like just show me the offerings from China, which I mean I find fascinating actually when I come through here. Or something a journalist asked me about today is if you go in and you look at things by landscape categories, but then you say, I'm just curious what Amazon's offerings are. And you can just dive in and cut down, that's only 10 cards, but you can see each of their offerings in each of these different categories. And so if I like the fact that the interactive version is aggregated but allows you to filter in to see just what you're interested in, and then the static ones, it seems like there's more of an argument. You could split them up. Please.
How do you detect dead projects and remove them?
How do I detect the projects and remove them? And it's a great question. So I do actually have clear rules on this. And I think this is actually another one of the really valuable things of the interactive landscape. And I'm just going to go down to show the rules here under non-updated items. And I have two little sorts that I follow. So on open source, I'm looking for projects to have a new commit at least once every 3 months. And the argument is, hey, you don't need to be under active development, you don't need to make huge changes, but just a sort of basic sign of maintenance is that you're making some kind of commits at all and that you haven't lost interest. And for what it's worth, a couple of these are all 3 months. And this one, I have an issue with the mirror. But I do follow that, and then each month or so, I have already taken half a dozen off, which I think is great. I mean, for me, that's success, that this thing isn't always growing. Then on the products, the closed source ones, my equivalent of that is Twitter. And so if you have a product, and so in fact, this is an example of one. So this is called Buddy Build. They're CI/CD, they're a startup, they've raised $8.8 million based in Vancouver, but they haven't tweeted in 3 months. And so when that hits 4 months, I'm gonna remove them. There's no hard feelings about it. I'm not trying to make a value judgment there. And then if they sort of realize, oh, we lost our social media person and something happened, they can just reapply and we'll add them back a month later. But the Twitter it's actually a pretty valuable sign of life where active companies and products are eager to tweet and to let people know what they're up to. And it also tends to be a really good just view into sort of what's new in that product in that area. Now the exception where that doesn't work is essentially the Chinese companies don't have Twitter because it's banned there. And so, but conveniently we have a China office and we work with them. And so I think we're doing a decent job that we know all of these companies are still active. And it's only like a dozen. I mean, the vast majority of folks, Twitter is a surprisingly good news source. That was one of the kind of surprises for me, is how valuable this sort was to be able to say, show me only closed source, and I'll just point out under license here, and then sort by tweet. Let me just mention one other thing we've been working on. So here's all of our open source projects, and I can group them by license, which is pretty interesting to see how unpopular AGPL is. It's extremely rare. Apache 2.0 by far, and I'm going to sort it by alphabetical, is by far the most popular, and the requirement to become a CNCF project is Apache 2.0, so we're not unbiased on that, but tons of non-Apache, non-projects are as well. Of course, if they ever wanted to be in a CNCF project, it would be helpful for them to start out as Apache 2.0. BSD 2 clause, 3 clause, a very small number of GPL, 2 and 3, couple others, more MIT, I think. And then, Mozilla public license. And then, unfortunately, I have these 41 unknown license ones. And GitHub runs a piece of software called Licensee. It's a Ruby gem that analyzes the repo and then says what the license is. And I have an intern who's been going around to each of these projects, cloning them locally, running licensee on it, and then saying, oh, you changed the copyright here, but you're actually supposed to change it over here, or you added this line at the top of your license and it confuses it, and then she creates a pull request with the project and says you can, if you use this standard license, then GitHub will identify it correctly, and then GitHub will share that information with us. And so that's just an example where we're trying to sort of be good citizens and improve the quality of the data, and then we're also trying to fix it upstream. We don't want to have any of that information locally. And similarly, actually the first project she did is we had about 50 of these projects had no, we get the location for them, like drone is in San Francisco. That's I'll just give you another quick view here that I think is kind of interesting, which is I can reset and then say group by headquarters location. And so like here's Amsterdam, the Netherlands, there's two of them, and then Armonk, New York, and you go through, and I think it's sort of as you guess. So Apache's, their corporate headquarters is in Maryland, but when you come all the way down here, London is number 2, so we have 21 items there, And any guesses on the #1 location? Mountain View, 22. New York, 13. And we come down Raleigh, so that's Red Hat, 17. And San Francisco, 128. Yeah, and I want to point out that's not even the San Francisco Bay Area. Mountain View, Palo Alto, all those are separate. 128 just in San Francisco, which is insane. Now, CNCF is also technically headquartered in San Francisco, so that's like 22 of them. But so much traction in this space there. So anyway, the other piece that we did is go research every project, find a location for it, and then we created an account on Crunchbase for them if it wasn't already there, and put in whatever information we could find for it. And again, if anything was wrong, anyone's welcome to go fix it, but there is kind of a crowdsource aspect of this. I have 3 minutes left, or yeah. Any other questions? Please.
Are you planning on having a party if all 500 projects graduate?
Yeah, it would be great to have a graduation party, or we could have just had a little celebration there, going from 499 to 500. It seemed like we did it without very much ceremony. And the other piece that just happened this week is we just crossed over 1 million stars in aggregate, which, yeah, I'm not sure that actually means anything. But it's the same message of having 4,300 people show up here in Copenhagen, which is there's so much interest in this space. And I will, I guess, finish on that hellscape comment, because obviously it's hard not to take it a little bit personally. But I feel like CNCF sometimes gets criticized for this, on saying, oh, it's so complicated, and you're making it so confusing. And of course, we did try and have an antidote for that with the trail map, which isn't, yeah, there it is, to say, hey, here's a simpler version of it if you want it. But the reality is, there is no enterprise in the world that's using just the 20 CNCF projects, and no other project, and no closed source product. Everyone is using a mix, and so everyone's making their own trail through the cloud-native ecosystem. And so we think that we're actually adding some value here by helping to create a map and showing what the options are. And to the degree that you're unhappy with that map, or think that the terrain is rougher, or there's too many paths, shooting the map maker doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. So thanks all very much for coming. And if you're curious, I do have one more session on this, I think Friday, where I'll go into a little bit more detail on how we built some of these pieces. Yeah, thank you.